Hey, listen!
Welcome everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and this time we are going to have a bit of discussion on if The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom means the end for traditional Zelda. And when I say traditional Zelda, I don't really mean technically traditional Zelda, because both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, while they may be the open-air style of Zelda game, they are inspired off the original Zelda, Legend of Zelda, for the NES and the Famicom, which was a top-down Zelda game with a lot of open-world elements. When we say traditional Zelda, and I say that with air quotes, most are usually referring to games like Link to the Past, and Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess. The games that came out in the 90s and the early 2000s leading up until 2013, where we saw A Link Between Worlds that started to go away from this direction. These Zeldas were more linear. The story you experienced in a linear fashion, it wasn't really told out of order. The dungeons you experienced in a linear fashion, you couldn't really do them out of order with some minor exceptions. And the ultimate idea would be that you would obtain a power-up or an item in a dungeon which would allow you to progress even further and explore and find other environments in the world, which would facilitate a linear adventure throughout Hyrule or whatever other environment you would explore in the different Zelda games. But Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, they give you most of your abilities in the beginning, and you're ultimately only limited by your creativity. There are still some restraints like building up your stamina meter or your battery meter or just having more materials and resources, but the point is you can explore the world and experience the story and the dungeons and the other challenges in whatever order you choose. But because of the linear structure of prior Zelda games, there are some things that were done that many fans enjoyed and they're not really seeing too much of in the current ones, so some would like them to return. Will they? At least in some shape or form? Well, that's what we're talking about today. But before we go further, let me point out that we are aiming to hit 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. With your help, it just might be possible. So I'm going to go ahead and read this small excerpt from this interview conducted by RTL News, a Netherlands news outlet that got to speak with the producer of Tears of the Kingdom, Eiji Aonuma. So he was asked, "The last two Zeldas are very different. Old fans sometimes say they prefer a classic old-fashioned Zelda. Would you like to do that again?" Aonuma responds, "It's hard to say anything about the future. That said, thanks to earlier Zeldas, a game like Tears of the Kingdom now exists. This game was born from the ideas we had in the past. We always try to make something that offers more than previous productions. In that respect, we are really not concerned with our old games anymore. We prefer to focus on the future." So with this said, I think it's made clear that there isn't any real intention or plan to go back to the old style of Zelda games. And by old, the style before Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But I also think it should be noted that this also means that the style of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom aren't going to be exactly how it'll be in the future either. They are going to continue to push ahead and come up with new ideas to evolve and improve the series. And when you take a look at Tears of the Kingdom in comparison to Breath of the Wild, I would say that there was a lot of elements incorporated in Tears of the Kingdom that are reminiscent of prior Zeldas that made it feel like a little bit more of a hybrid and thus more enjoyable for a larger part of the fan base. So for example, while the memories did return in Tears of the Kingdom, which meant we could experience a lot of the story in basically whatever order we choose as we explore the world, if we really care to do that, then we'll allow us to experience the story in a more linear fashion. But even going beyond the memories, that's not the extent of the story. There are a number of events that occur afterwards that can only happen once we complete these memories, and some of the dungeons. So in other words, Tears of the Kingdom has some linear elements, and this is done to facilitate a story that I would argue is a bit more compelling. There are some changes, there are some twists and turns. Also, the very prologue of Tears of the Kingdom is telling a bit more of a compelling narrative than Breath of the Wild. And this is something that reminds me of prior Zelda games where there'll be some longer cutscenes to tell a little bit more of a story. But story isn't always the strongest point in Zelda games, not to say that it's bad, but it also isn't the focus. What some fans gripe about when it comes to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is really the dungeons. And to some extent I agree with this because I do feel that the dungeons in Breath of the Wild lacked variety, and also once you sort of figured out the puzzle for one, the mechanics were very similar for all the others. And then also the boss fights are very similar as well. They don't stand out as much, and they kind of pale in comparison to prior Zelda games with their designs. And I think Tears of the Kingdom remedies this significantly. All the dungeons feel very different from each other, they have their own unique themes, the music stands out a bit more as well, and while you still have to go around activating 4 or 5 terminals very much like Breath of the Wild, the puzzles involved within the dungeon are all very unique and different from each other, as opposed to it all being around just moving around some sort of gyroscope to change around the structure of that dungeon with the Divine Beast in Breath of the Wild. So the dungeons stand out a bit more, they have more variety, they have more of a theme and a story, and they all conclude with a unique and epic boss fight. And I would say the boss fights in Tears of the Kingdom are far better and far more varied than Breath of the Wild, which does remind me of the style of boss fights we saw in prior Zelda games. Now, these bosses are still within the context of the open air style, so you do have more options in terms of how you deal with them, but it still does remind me of the prior Zelda games, and I think that this is a better middle ground. And when I say better, I mean to imply that in the future, they can improve upon this even more so. I think there is a hybrid that incorporates a lot of the ideas from prior Zelda games in an open-air style that even more fans will enjoy to a greater level. And that's why I think it's important when Aonuma says we prefer to focus on the future. They are continually looking ahead to make their games better. And this may incorporate elements from prior Zelda games and improving upon them or remixing them in some sort of way. But it also means coming up with new concepts and ideas that can be incredible, that can be mind-blowing, which is what brings a lot of us to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. They're not going to shy away from this more large-scale style. They're just going to look for ways to make it better. The sales for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom far surpass any other Zelda by a very significant margin. From a business perspective, it makes zero sense to just go back. But to play devil's advocate, while the open-air Zelda games have sold way better than any prior Zelda game, they have enjoyed their success on the Switch. This is a new era for Nintendo where other games can see greater sales. So if Nintendo were to focus their efforts on a traditional Zelda, and I say that with air quotes, but something like a modern Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, then that game, I do believe, will enjoy incredible sales. But I also think that the open-air style brings in a larger audience. It suggests a more grandiose and epic adventure. It's a bit more exciting for a larger audience, so perhaps in that way it may seem a bit more mainstream. But it goes beyond that with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom because they incorporate so much elements in terms of exploring the world that lead to so many unique discoveries that you wouldn't see with most other games. And there are also these giant playgrounds where you're free to experiment and do all these different things. More people enjoy this style of Zelda game. So I don't think they're going to go away from this, but I think they're going to think of ways to make it even better. And as I said before, I do believe this will mean incorporating some prior tropes and elements from other Zelda games, as they sort of already did to some extent in Tears of the Kingdom, and they will find a better middle ground, while bringing in new ideas as well. So while I do believe that that's going to be the focus of the Zelda team, I still have some optimism that we could see some form of traditional Zelda again. For example, we have the 2D Zelda series, and while A Link Between Worlds you were able to do dungeons out of order, there's no guarantee they'll do that with the next one. We did get the Link's Awakening remake a few years ago, and that was a pretty great remake. A lot of people enjoyed that game. We could see other remakes in the future, and while that wouldn't be a brand new game, seeing remakes as opposed to just a remaster is nice to see. They get the visual overhaul. Sometimes they have some additional content added. So there is that kind of potential. And because Tears of the Kingdom took such a long time to make, and because I also think we are approaching the end of this Switch generation for a number of reasons, it's going to be a long time before we see the next big Zelda game. And Nintendo's probably going to want to have some kind of content in between to excite Zelda fans, not just for the end of the Switch generation, but also for the early years of the new generation. Maybe some of that ties into Tears of the Kingdom DLC as they transition over in these next few years. Maybe some of that also means bringing back Twilight Princess and Wind Waker HD. Now, those games I wouldn't expect too many changes, but those could come. And maybe that also means another 2D Zelda, be it a remake or a brand new entry. But I also think there is an opportunity where Nintendo may start to go back to some of their prior Zelda games and remake them. It wouldn't be as grandiose of an effort as making a whole-on new open-air Zelda, so maybe they could have a separate team where there may be some overseeing and some help from the main Zelda team, but for the most part, the main Zelda team will be able to focus on the next major Zelda. But this might allow us to see something like Ocarina of Time made truly modern, and I don't just mean the 3DS remake, I mean like an actual remake, and maybe they even change around the gameplay somewhat. Now, I'm not saying they would make it fully open world or anything like that, but there could be some gameplay changes to make it feel more modern and fresh, and perhaps feel like a new experience, while still being a love letter to Ocarina of Time fans. I think there's some potential for that. That is just speculation. We don't know if that's going to happen, but once Twilight Princess and Wind Waker are made available on Switch, all 3D Zeldas will be available on modern hardware, and all of them will receive some level of remaster already. So it may make sense to eventually go back to them again, but this time not just remaster them, fully remake them. Maybe something closer to what we see with what Capcom's doing with the Resident Evil games, where there are some significant changes. I think this would be the best opportunity to see the return of a traditional Zelda in some sort of grand way beyond just a remaster. But again, that is just speculation. I think the most likely bet is that future Zelda games are just going to continue to push forward and evolve, but this may still include some elements that will be reminiscent of prior entries. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andre's Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.